everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts, one of whom is distracting me by pointing at things.
What happened to the light?
I took it down because the light is all busted, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to take it off, and then if the light is busted, I can easily get to the light, as opposed to putting the fixture on and off and on and off. But who is asking me such a question? Who is that?
Diana. I live here.
And it's me. I don't live here, but sometimes I do.
What's your name?
Oh, Jackie.
Hey, Jackie. Hey, Diana. But this is not a podcast about home improvement. If it were, we would have no reviews, no stars.
Do
because
not
we know nothing
listen.
about home review. No. This is a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. Every week, we pick an exciting topic in the field, and we discuss articles related to that topic. This week, we will be talking about something very important. Or is it very important? Thoughts?
Let the audience decide.
We'll let you decide.
At the end of the show.
Fill it out on a scale from 1 to 6. Did you find this topic to be very important? Not very important? Kind of important.
Call 555-1525 and rate for your favorite article. Just like American Idol.
Oh,
Remember
yeah?
that?
That show's still
I
on.
do.
I don't watch it.
No, I don't either. In case you couldn't guess, we are talking this week about social validity.
Neat.
I know. I expected more from my co-hosts. Yes. So social validity. So we will be talking about 4 articles.
4. That's a lot. 4
I know.
articles. We're doing
Hopefully
it.
we'll get through them all, I think.
We're sliding in.
But we'll be talking all about social validity, which is a topic that, honestly, I wasn't sure anyone had done much with until, say, the 2000s, and we'll kind of talk about how that actually seems to be a trend that occurred, but has been an issue that has been bubbling up in behavior analysis since the mid and late 70s in terms of, is social validity something that we should even care about? Why don't we, before we talk about what articles we're reading, really briefly discuss what social validity means to you, either through just reading the definition or in your socially valid definition of social validity?
So I'm going to paraphrase what my definition of social validity is. It's, are we doing what we should be doing for the people that we're doing it for?
Okay. That's a pretty good one.
That's what I think.
Donna, how about you? What's your definition of social? How do you describe social validity?
Social validity is a subjective measure, but an important one, and it's useful in determining if the changes that we've produced in behavior are acceptable and sufficient for the people that they matter for. There.
Also great.
Trailed
Yes.
off there on the end.
I usually think of social validity, if I have to explain it really quickly, as, did anyone care? Anyone? Anyone care? Does it matter to you or you? To anyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you said, Rob, that you felt that this was an issue that was being brought up early-ish in behavior analysis regarding whether this was something that we should care about, but I would argue that the topic of social validity is completely baked into applied behavior analysis from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I think so too. I agree.
Right, so...
Or it should have been, right?
It
like
is.
crux,
I mean,
yeah.
issue 1, volume 1 is Bear, Wolfers, Lee, 1968, and they walk through the 7 dimensions of behavior analysis, and the very first one is applied, right? So we're here as applied behavior analysis to tackle issues of social importance. For something to be determined socially important, the people who are being affected by the treatment and by the behavior itself have to determine that the problem is socially important, that the way that we're going to address the problem is important, and that the effects that we get at the end of the treatment are also valid and important too, right? So that touches on the applied portion of behavior analysis, and it touches on whether the treatment that we used was effective as well.
To the client, right? So we could see something as effective, but they might not see it as effective.
Right,
so.
exactly. Right. So it's not only up to us to say, yep, we did it, we solved that problem, the behavior looks good to us, and our job here is done. It's really not. It has to do with not just the client, but the whole client package, right? Like everyone who touches that client, whether they all deem that the problem has been solved sufficiently and in the manner that they agree with. So I really love that about behavior analysis, because we think of it as a hard science, right? Like we're really interested in observable and measurable behavior. And there's that side of behavior analysis, which is really important. But there's also this other subjective side where we can solve problems, But if we don't all agree that those were the right problems to solve or that they've been solved satisfactorily, then our job is not done. And there's always going to be that sort of like soft underbelly side to behavior analysis, which I think is really nice. And we're going to talk about these articles.
Yeah, that's our first article, actually. You did a really nice segue into the first article.
So we'll be talking about 4 articles spanning the decades. We'll be starting with Social Validity, the case for subjective measurement, or How Applied Behavior Analysis is Finding Its Heart. And that's by Montrose Wolf in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 1978. Disco was in full swing. And something else probably happened in the 70s.
Staying alive. Staying alive.
Yeah, Bee Gees were there as well.
We're there as well.
We'll be talking about An Assessment of Social Validity Trends in Applied Behavior Analysis by Carr, Austin, Britton, Kellum, and Bailey. And that was in Behavioral Interventions, 1999. We'll move
What
in
song should I say?
1999.
Ain't no lie, baby, bye, bye, bye.
No,
Is
that was
right?
the 2000s.
That was 2000.
But,
Heart in a blender, watch it spin.
Yeah,
something like that sounds-
Oblivion.
there you go.
Right.
And then we'll be moving on to On the Effectiveness of and Preference for Punishment and Extinction Components of Function-Based Interventions by Hanley, Piazza, Fisher, and Maglieri in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 2005. You got any songs? No? You ran out?
Gold Digger.
Oh.
Don't ya wish your girlfriend was
Oh,
like
that
me.
song?
Oh.
Don't you wish your girlfriend was something like me?
Oh.
No, I was
Don't
gonna sing you the one.
That was
I
2005.
definitely don't know the name of the song I want to sing you. Can I just
Your
telepathically?
description of not knowing what it is really helping
I
me
just
remember.
telepathically
You got to give me a
relate it.
cue. Some sort of
You don't have to cut
context
this part
clue.
out. It's a girl. It's like a goth band.
Wake me up inside.
Evanescence.
Take me
Yeah.
up
He knew.
I don't think that is 2005 though.
Who knows?
It didn't come up in the top 100 songs of 2005.
Okay.
And then finally, caregiver preference for reinforcement-based interventions for problem behavior maintained by positive reinforcement by Gabor, Fritz, Roth, and Gorley in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 2016.
That was when Trolls came out and Justin
Oh.
Timberlake did Can't Stop the Feeling.
Okay, there you go.
Got this feeling in my body.
Is this like a new segment where we're going to like name songs from the year our articles came out?
No, but that just happened.
Because I don't think I like it. Anyway. Moving on. Let's get in the Wayback Machine and go back to 1978 when Montrose Wolf
Who
wrote-
should be my best friend. I think we're honestly kindred spirits.
I
He was
sort
wearing
of
the bell bottoms.
Mm-hmm.
Was
Wide
he?
belt.
If he was in the 70s. He does
Yeah,
have a lot of hair and a beard.
Yeah.
I looked him up.
Oh, okay.
You got the polo shirt, striped polo shirt tucked in.
Mm-hmm.
A wide belt.
Oh, okay.
The scene's been set.
Okay, there we go. And he decided it was important to write an article all about the idea of whether or not behavior analysts should be studying social validity. And again, spoiler, he comes to the conclusion that yes, behavior analysts should be studying social validity. But what I appreciated about this article is 2 things. One, I don't think people write articles like this anymore where they're sort of like, let's just chat about something, guys, and I'll tell you a story, which I feel like you could only do if you were doing behavior analysis back in the 60s and 70s, and you just can't do that anymore. You just can't write those articles anymore.
Nobody wants you to be like, come along on my fire. There's my little logs.
No.
Come to my
Yeah.
fire. Let's talk about how I may have screwed up. Because that's how it starts, right? He's
Yeah.
like, I'm doing this journal. I've got it going on.
I think you got to go to a conference and see some of like the luminaries are sort of, going to the conferences and reflecting on the past.
Yeah.
I think this is the closest you're going to get
Mhm.
to an article
Right.
like this anymore.
But, so he's not reflecting on the past, though. He's reflecting on his present.
On the present,
Right?
yes.
Mhm.
He was like, crap, I need a mission statement for the Journal of
Yep.
Applied Behavior Analysis that's going to be in press, like, in 1 minute.
Yeah, I
And
love the start of this.
Me
Yeah.
too.
Wait,
Yeah.
I got to do my number 2. My number 2 that I like about this article
Oh.
Sorry, I forgot about your
is,
twos.
yeah, you guys don't have the monopoly on saying, I love this article and here's why.
Okay, why do you love this
And
article?
number 2, that it looks at social validity as something that is not incredibly complicated, but there are complications involved in it in a very positive way, sort of looking at the future and how we will overcome them. what's the exact quote? I wrote the quote down, but the idea that data is our thing, so we don't need to worry about whatever measurement we decide is a field we need. We will rise to the challenge of making it the best damn measurement we can make it. So we set the stage. We kind of talked generally about this. Jackie, you were kind of getting into, and Dana, you were mentioning sort of the idea of this article, telling a little story about where Montrose Wolf came up with the idea of, maybe we should be looking more closely at this social validity thing, really coming from a conversation he had in coming up with the purpose of Java way back in 1968.
I don't even think it was a conversation, though. It sounds as if he wrote it as if he ran into the hallway, went to everyone's office, and they're like, he's not there, and he mentions these are the bigwigs in the field, right? And what I want to point out is that he mentions 2 women, Barbara Etzel and Judy LeBlanc, so that's always nice, as well as, Vance Hall, Bill Hopkins, Keith Miller, Todd Risley, who was his best friend, Jim Sermon. I'm just making that up, but they write a lot together, so I'm assuming they're best friends with me in there.
And he bumps into Don Baer.
Yeah, and he's like, "Hey, Don, I need a mission statement." And then he's like, "And just Don, just pulls back his hair and is like, of course it's going to be, and I quote, application for the analysis of behavior to problems of social importance. Duh, Wolf." I feel like that's what he would say.
Yep. And so that's where, like you mentioned at the top of the show, Diana, the idea that social validity is a part of behavior analysis, whether we specifically called it social validity or not at the time. That was part of the applied.
Yes, they didn't necessarily have that term, right? But they were calling it social importance. So issues of social import, we could say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love that he writes it down too. He's like, sounds great. Yeah. He writes it down and he's like, oh crap.
But what does that mean?
Sends it off,
became the problem.
Right, to the publisher, and then
We've all done this. We've all done this, woken up in the middle of the night and been like,
And I think nowadays we live in a really touchy-feely time where people do, the idea of course you want to ask people who you are engaged with in any type of endeavor, whether it's scientific, behavior analytic, economic, social, anything. Is this doing what it purports to do? Do you, as the person receiving some sort of a service, like the service or feel it's right for you? That seems very natural. But at the time, there was a lot of pushback on the idea of caring about what people thought about what you were doing. Like, who gives a crap? It's look at these facts. I'm a professor. I know what I'm doing.
Quite like that.
No. Well, I think that's the stage he set for effect in the art in this article.
I think he said that it matters if things are effective, right? So if it matters, it doesn't really matter if you love it because it really works. You don't need to love something to have it work, right? I think that's kind of what he was saying. You can like it or not like it, but he said the researcher says that's what he was saying. If it works, you should love it because it works.
Exactly.
Right.
And the idea that all we want to use are objective measures. That's all we have. I like his little joke about it felt like there was a group of people who just wanted to put micro switches under every child in the country to make sure that, we weren't using any measurement, any objective measurement that could be skewed in any way.
Yeah, but I think that we have grown a lot in our field since this time period. And at this point in time, behavior analysis was an extremely young field and only had started to be able to distinguish itself from psychology and methodological behaviorism fairly recently, right? So the distinction that was required to be made there was twofold. First, that we need to only measure things that are observable and measurable. Sorry, I know I said measured twice, but everything that's going to count as behavior is observable and measurable. And the other side of that is we do believe that feelings exist and are important. Oh, yeah. It's just that they still are difficult to measure, right? So we're not discounting them, but when we talk about behavior that we're measuring for change, we're going to pick something that we can all agree on because it's something that can be observed and measured.
And the private events don't relate to or aren't needed for a functional analysis of behavior.
Skinner says that.
Which Skinner says. Montrose Wolf doesn't necessarily agree.
He doesn't necessarily agree with that. But one thing I love about this is when he puts it in, he's waiting for the criticism, right? Because what does socially significant mean? And then he's like, but then people were just taking it and they were using it as a crux for the articles. And then he was like, I was surprised that people wanted more socially significant research. Why are you just doing this? So that's something that you think about.
The social validity feedback for the articles was there needs to be more social validity.
Right? Why aren't we looking at more socially significant problems? And I think that is where he was like, okay, good. I didn't mess up. This is where we are. We have these objective measurements, and that's great, but maybe that's not where we need to stop, right? So it's okay that we also have these subjective measures looking at the importance.
Yeah, and one of the main points that he's making here, too, is that when we are including social validity measures in our research, they're a secondary measure to a primary dependent variable. So in other portions of psychology, you may see a lot of survey research, right? That's the only measure that they're looking at is how do you feel now? And if this change has occurred, right? Like rate your own level of depression. And there's no other type of behavioral measure on which to hang your hat. What we would be doing here is we are including some more subjective measurement systems, but they're as a secondary measure to say, how do you feel about the changes that were made? And the changes are recorded using primary hard data collection system, right? So he makes that distinction, and I think that's sort of how he helps to compartmentalize a little bit what social validity is for in our field. But I also loved that he said, everyone recognized what it was, right?
Yeah.
Like when some studies had a little bit of it, meaning social validity, and some had a lot of it, even though it was something that was difficult to define. Everyone was sort of coming to a consensus on what that meant, which also seemed to validate that it's something that was important and that we could all sort of agree on.
Right. And I love the examples that he gives us. So he gives us 2 articles, one by Jones and Azra in 1969, when they were are pretty prevalent in our field and have laid a really great foundation for behavior analysis. And they were looking at speech and how to work on decreasing a stutter in speech. And so they had done it, and there was almost no speech using beats, I believe.
Stutter.
It was like a tempo measure.
Right, that would
like
decrease
the breathing and
right, would decrease stuttering. But no one loved it because this speech sounded robotic, or what's the word when it's monotone. And so then they varied up the beats and asked judges to rate the acceptableness of...
It was the naturalness.
The naturalness, right, of the speech. And I love that because then it shows, right, like, yes, we found something that was effective, but it wasn't necessarily, no one was really buying in.
And that sounds like a study. If you read that in this last issue of JABA, you'd be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Of course, you'd want to have a... But in the 69 article, the idea of, are we going to get in trouble that we have this measure, and Wolf is sort of having to be the head editor, has to look and say, you know what, I understand what you're doing and I want you to do it, but the elephant in the room is there are going to be people in the field who do not feel this is an appropriate component of your study. I kind of wish we could go through every example, but with 4 articles,
we don't.
We just have to recommend everyone should, if they have not, should read this article, because like we said, you don't read articles like this anymore where looking at the research is more like a bedtime story about how this came to be, rather than just, let me describe some other articles that did something similar, and this is how I came to the article I'm writing now, which is a replication or extension. This is very different. It is very much just like, I'm just kind of chatting about research that happened, and my buddies did this research, and we talked about it, and we came up with it, and you just don't have those articles very much anymore.
Yeah. But I think our listeners can tell how much it impacted us to be able to read a story like this, right? And when you hear Pat Fryman talk about storytelling and the value of storytelling, it just makes what the subject matter is come alive that much more, right? Like I can picture Wolf going out in the hall and trying to find someone to ask, what's the purpose of Java? Right? And it just brings it all to life so much. So hopefully we can go back to that, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Social validity is high for effective storytelling.
Yeah. And Jagger, did you want to do just one other kind of example? You were saying there was another one that you liked?
The other example I liked was when, just quickly, they asked students, they put them in a personalized system of instruction. This was also 1969.
McMichael and Corey.
Yeah. And they asked students whether they liked the personalized system of instruction, or PSI, developed by Keller, or traditional lecture. And everyone said that they liked PSI better, and they actually did better as well, right? So you saw that it was effective and socially significant.
Yeah.
So that's nice.
Yeah. And I think Wolf brought up these examples because ultimately he was, I think, proven wrong by his level of alarm that he had for including the more subjective measures in the studies. Because he found that researchers were able to discern what was a subjective measure, what was an objective measure, and we didn't, as a field, go off the deep end into just pure subjectivity, right? There's a time and a place for including social validity.
Right.
But if we want to, at the end of the day, say, are our measures effective and have we produced the socially significant change that we wanted to produce? We cannot determine that without the team members being on board with the changes that are produced. And the way that we can determine their preference is through social validity.
So let's talk about Wolf's. He kind of had 3 points as to what is going to define what social validity is. And then I want to spend a little bit of time too talking about what are his kind of concerns about social validity as a subjective measure.
Sure.
And then we'll move into the more recent articles.
Yeah, I think that seems fair.
Okay.
Is it totally fair? Would you rate that fairness on a scale of 1 to 6 as not very fair, a little bit fair, kind of fair?
I like my Likert scales to be odd.
Yeah, me
No
too.
out of 5?
Most people do.
Or I really like 7.
Do you prefer your Likert scales to have 1, 2, 3?
I prefer 7.
7? Oh.
Do you know why? Because I never pick a 1 or a 7. So I
I can
actually
never come
like to
up
work
with-
on a 5-point scale, but not use either of the extreme choices.
I don't have enough adjectives to do
That's awesome.
comparative. Really, really like? So Montrose Wolf came up with sort of 3 components that he felt would help define social validity.
Number 1, the social significance of the goals that we choose. Number 2, the social appropriateness of the procedures, so how we go about making change. And number 3, the social importance of the effects, so the change that is produced.
And I love that he's like, the summarize of this, the answers to these questions refer to social validity.
Mhm.
I love it when he says that.
So when we're looking at these 3 components, I think they're all very similar in terms of sort of what the outcomes are, but really is what we're doing what our society wants? Is the procedure we're developing something that everyone considers acceptable? And I think some of our later studies will talk about what the difference is between, say, an acceptable treatment or a preferred treatment, because they are not exactly the same. Acceptable really having to do with the idea of everyone saying, yes, I will allow this treatment to occur because of the need that exists. And then the effects. So the idea of, is everyone happy with the results? And not just the results that we got, but the results that we didn't plan for that are hopefully positive, but you never know. With any treatment, you could have side effects that are not ideal, but again, may be considered, again, acceptable. There we go. So those are the components that you should be asking when you're looking at social validity of any treatment. But let's talk a little bit about how this might be tricky to measure. Because again, answering all of these questions, it is very challenging. It's a little easier nowadays, but at the time, there wasn't really any sort of an exact science of how you would measure these 3 without using some sort of a subjective measurement, which again, there's a lot of reference to sort of how Skinner would refer to those descriptions as it's, anytime people are talking about what they feel about something, they're talking about private events, talking about verbal behavior that isn't going to come in contact necessarily with society's reinforcement, which means it could kind of be a deceptive.
Or distorted.
Or distorted.
Is what Skinner
Yes, that's
usually
the-
talks about it. He usually talks about it as being distorted stimuli.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't necessarily come in contact with external variables of reinforcement or punishment.
Wolf had a couple ideas as to what this would look like, and I think some of his colleagues sort of gave him some ideas. So you want to talk about a couple? Let's talk about a couple of those.
So I think one of his main points is that you can use the assessments or interviews to make decisions about what's important for the community. So ask the community first. This is not unlike a line of research called participatory action research that's going on now, where the community informs the researcher on what the problems of the community are. And if people want to reference that, there's 2 authors called White 2002. It's like the golden rule. That's what it's called, a call for participatory action research. And also Fawcett in 1991 in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. That's looking at like community-based research. And so using the community to help decide what your question is going to be, right? So you don't, as the researcher, come into a community and say, oh, I think this is the problem, I'm going to fix it, without actually asking. And if anyone has been a behavior analyst in the world and gone into a classroom and not first talked to the teacher and just said, aha, this is the problem, you can see how that's been met. Probably not with a lot of buy-in, right, or support for that sort of treatment planning. And so I think that's where he's talking about there, is that you want to make sure that you're getting feedback from the community that you're actually doing research on before you do.
One of the things that I found interesting in reading this article, given how old an article it is the idea that, hey, you gather your group, you make your definitions, you compare, what you're objectively seeing with the subjective measures, you take into account what the society writ large, whatever your group is,
Right.
Thinks about your treatments, your procedures, the outcomes. And then seeing that more as a starting place.
Right.
Because certainly I think of social, oh, it's like a Likert scale, right? You could do that. Yeah, it's I guess kind of subjective, but don't worry about it, I suppose. And then like we'll talk about in the Hanley article, we've got our concurrent operance designs kind of come out. And then knowing those two and then reading this, I say, oh, wait, the only one of these things that has really been a huge advancement in our ability to make better subjective measurements slightly more objective would be the concurrent operance design. And Wolf was calling for, hey, everybody, this is a great start, but let's keep going with this stuff. Let's improve our science. You know, we're good at data. We can make better data systems. And then it's kind of feeling sad, like, oh, and then someone did something in 97 and that's all we got so far. Like, there's more we should be doing with this.
And I think we are. I think as a field, we're moving in that direction now, right? So I think as a field, we are trying to incorporate all of the values of the society that we're working with and incorporating client choice and client preference and acceptability of procedures. So we all know punishment works, right? And even in our ethical code, we have to use reinforcement over punishment. So I think we are trying to move in that direction. And I think we're doing an okay job. I mean, we're actively trying to do something. So I think that's better than being like, aha, this is nothing, right?
Yeah.
So, but obviously we could do more.
There's generally a nice focus on parent interview and during the assessment portion when we're choosing what we're going to target as skills for increase or behavior for decrease. And that's part of social validity as well.
Right. And looking at the effects of behavioral treatment, I think we've done a good job on. So we might want to get something to 0, right? But that may not be what the parents believe is effective, right? So we all engage in some sort of stereotypic behavior, right? So we might not try to get stereotypy down to 0 levels, but maybe teach the individual to engage in it when it's appropriate and not when it's inappropriate, right? So I think that's one of the ways we're moving in a socially valid way when we're treating problem behavior, right? Is not trying to just get rid of it, wash it out, right? Teach when it's appropriate and when it's not. So I think that's a nice way that we're moving in this direction.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And I know one of the kind of the last points that was made in the article was the idea of social validity and the improvement of our subjective measurements being an evolutionary step for our field. And that really spoke to me, I think, especially given a lot of the topics that we've covered on the show related to, say, mental health, behavior therapies. We talked about ACT, anxiety. Should we study anxiety as behavior analysts? Really that idea of there are areas that have felt kind of verboten to some extent. We shouldn't be involved in some of these areas because they don't relate to the things that we've learned how to do. They revolve around too much subjective measurement. And to some extent, I think we're kind of facing similar situations now at behavior analysis, unless we want to be the field that does organizational behavior management and autism. And that's it, folks. We really do have to start thinking about, how can we do some of the other pieces better? And, are we at another evolutionary jump stage?
There's a great quote in this article where he's talking about Martin Luther allowing dancing in his church. And the quote from him was, "Why should we let the devil have all the best tunes?" And then Mont Wolf's quote regarding that was, "Well, why should we let the others have all the best human goals and social problems?"
Oh, yes.
Right?
I took up a picture of Montrose Wolf, and now I have him sitting with us at the table.
He's wearing the shirt I described.
That's what he looks like?
He's wearing the striped polo that I described.
That is not at all what I imagined him looking like.
This is probably when he was a little bit older.
Still got the polo.
But he's still got the polo on.
Yeah.
So he's smiling at us like, well done, guys.
Oh, well, we shall see.
Yeah.
But I loved that quote. I thought that was great, right? So there's so many problems of the human condition that we all agree are socially valid challenges that need to be faced. And why not allow the people who know the most about how behavior functions and functions contextually within the environment to work on those types of problems, just because they might be measured in ways that have traditionally been more subjective. It doesn't mean that we can't, as we've talked about in other episodes, bring those over and find objective ways to measure them.
Yeah. And we run the risk too, if we say, well, it's too subjective, let's not bother. Well, we're never going to get better at measuring something if we don't even try. But it also doesn't mean that that kind of request from the rest of society won't still be there. Yeah.
So he gives a really nice example, too, of we're basically operationally defining warmth. And what does it mean to be warm and caring? And when you observe people who are engaging those types of behaviors, there are actually many different observable responses that are included within that definition. And when you break it down, you can objectively quantify warmth.
I like that too. He's like leaning in, eye contact. Yeah. We all know that if the waitress touches us, we're giving a higher tip, right? Like,
right. So something like that, we just need to sort of spin it and think about it in a different way. And then can I give you guys the other quote that I loved?
Yes.
Out of this article.
Golden nugget.
Golden nugget, quote, "It is the participant and other consumers who make the final decision about whether a program helped solve their problems."
I love that.
End quote.
Given how excited and jazzed we all are, we assume that the rest of the field immediately grabbed this up and it's never looked back at social validity. But maybe it didn't quite go that way. Let's take a little break, and when we come back, we'll talk about social validity into the future. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking about social validity. So when we last left off, we were back in the 70s, and now we're going to take the DeLorean and head into 1999. But one more thing before we do, I just wanted all of our listeners, in case you didn't know, to hear this fun fact. ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to ABA Inside Track, you are eligible for 1 Type 2 CE. All you need to do is listen to the episode, go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs, and you need to fill out a little form, including 2 code words. And I'm going to give you the first of those secret code words right now. It is Judy. Judy. Judy, Judy, Judy.
I love how you said that. Nice.
I know what you're doing. It's a Mr. Show skit.
It's the Mr. Show. Judy. All right, so when we left off, we were in the 70s, now we're in the 90s, and Jim Carr and colleagues decided to take a look at where social validity was in terms of the field of behavior analysis. Had we started engaging in the use of more social validity measures, less, the same?
I was kind of hoping when I picked this article up that he would have been like, one night while I was just reviewing all of my old Java articles next to my bedstand.
I was working at my
Right?
desk late one night.
I found this article by Montrose Wolf from the 60s that talked about social validity, and I thought to myself, where did we go from here? I don't think that happened, but maybe it did. We should email Dr. Carr and ask him.
I guess.
From the
How
90s.
we
Maybe
thought
I
of the
will.
article?
Yeah, like where did this? I love those ideas. Like where was this? Where was the inception of this article?
I mean, maybe
right?
it was the same thing that, all of us probably do to some extent. When you read a lot of articles, you start to notice patterns like, man, it feels like everybody's doing procedural integrity measures. Like I still remember as a student reading articles and noticing, oh, people are really starting to pay closer attention to procedural integrity measures, because I don't remember seeing that in a lot of the old articles from, grad school. But then as I read articles more and more on my own, I noticed it. I was like, oh, this must be a thing. Everyone wants this now.
Right.
Okay. It's a good idea. Should have been there to begin, but maybe didn't get thought of, or who knows? Maybe it was the same thing. Maybe Jim Carr was looking at articles and was like, didn't people used to report on social validity more? I feel like that was a thing back,
And he's like, let's look it
in
up.
the 70s and 80s. I'm going to read every single Java and see.
Some time.
My bedside table is large.
You're suffering from insomnia. It's like, I gotta read all these articles.
One thing I do love about this, though, is that this is something that begs to be replicated.
It really does.
Mhm.
It's begging.
It's been almost 20. Oh, it has been 20 years.
Shut up.
I
That's
know.
disgusting.
And I think given the
Right?
final results of this article, it would be
You're like-
very important to
Yeah.
know whether we saw a change.
All right, maybe we're going to have to get our graduate assistants on this, Diana.
Yeah.
All right. Here's
Anyway.
a stack of every journal ever. You only need to go to 98.
Have fun.
So we should probably talk about what
Sure, what
Carr
they
and
did.
colleagues did
what
here.
did they do, Rob?
Well, one of the issues that came up was Jim Carr and colleagues asking, hey, are we actually using that much social validity in our studies? This was kind of an extension of an article by Kennedy, who had looked at behavioral interventions and
That was
journal.
in 92.
Yes, that was back in 92. And looked at behavioral interventions and looked at Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis to review what types of social validity measures were being used, like were they using subjective evaluations or some sort of a normative comparison in terms of assessing social validity? Were they looking at assessments related to goals, treatment acceptability, the treatment outcomes, and then sort of looking at how many articles were using one of those measures. And it looked like about 20% of the articles. But what Carr and colleagues wanted to know was, how frequently are social validity measures being taken for treatment outcome and acceptability across the 31 years that JABA had been published? Because JABA is the best journal of all time. And of course, if it has great social validity measures or it has terrible ones, then all other journals will follow because it's so good. I'm like, what?
One thing I loved here is that the methods are so concise.
Yep.
Right? It is a paragraph.
Yeah, right?
Like, here is exactly what we did, down to the volume.
Mm-hmm.
And not that great. Spoiler.
What, the results?
Yeah.
Oh,
The methods were fun.
No, the methods were amazing.
The other piece that they
It's
wanted to
pretty
look
simple.
at was from 1992 to 1998. They wanted to look a little bit closely at measures regarding treatment outcome and acceptability in articles that were using like an analog setting. So by analog setting, a setting in which the participant really only ever went to a room that was only used for the purpose of doing research, or a naturalistic setting. So again, a setting that the participant would access multiple times throughout the day, whether it was a hospital, their bedroom,
Right.
their school, wherever that was. In terms of that succinct method, pretty much whoever it was in the group scored every research article written in JABA from 1968 onward, and they were looking, was there some sort of a presence of a treatment outcome measure? Was it a formal measure to compare treatment results with some sort of established behavioral norm? Also, did the article have anything related to an assessment of the consumer satisfaction with the results of the treatment? Or perhaps they had a cost-benefit analysis featured in the article. They also scored for treatment acceptability reporting. Was that reported at all? It had to be something kind of formal, so some sort of like formal measure of consumer acceptance. It really could be anything systematic, though. It pretty much was any sort of acceptability measure that wasn't anecdotal. So, we
Right.
heard that mom loved treatment, would not count.
Right.
But we asked mom, how she felt on treatment on this scale of 1 to 5. That would have counted
Right.
as a measure of treatment acceptability.
And they highlight that it can be objective or subjective.
Yes.
In nature, in that
Yes.
formal measure.
It could
So
be
that's
pretty
important.
much anything that wasn't just someone like telling a little story in the
Right.
discussion section.
5 years ago, I had this study done. I mean, boy, did I love it. So that's
Yeah.
when that would not.
We got a letter from the participants saying, how
Yeah.
great our study was. Yeah, that wasn't
So to
gonna-
relate this back to Wolf, he highlighted those 3 areas of social validity, and this was looking at 2 of those areas. So
Right.
the treatment outcome one is related to social acceptability of the effects of treatment, and then the treatment acceptability one was related to social acceptability of the procedures.
Yes.
And so when it comes time to look at the results, I think,
sigh.
unfortunately, what you'll see is that after reading Montrose Wolf's article in 78, everyone got super jazzed, just like we were, about the idea of social validity. And throughout the end of the 70s and the early 80s, there was an increase in articles that were looking at some sort of a social validity measure where there was treatment outcome, treatment acceptability. So yay! Until about the mid-'80s. I don't know if it's because it was Reaganomics or what happened there, but throughout the late 80s and then into the 90s, you see a real either flattening out or even decrease in how much social validity was being reported
Yeah.
in JABA.
One
The
se-
go-go 90s just did not have time for
Right.
social validity.
One unfortunate thing I felt when I was reading this, when I was looking at the graph, I actually, when I got there, I was like, it's going to be amazing.
It's just going to go up,
Right?
up, and never
And
stop.
I can't wait. Like, when that's how I was feeling when I was reading. I'm like, I cannot wait. And then I was like, oh my goodness. The graph does not even go to 100%.
No, it only goes
No.
to 50.
50%.
And there was
we're-
only 1 year where it even got over 40%.
Right? Like, it
Which
is.
was 82, right after this was published.
Mhm.
Right after the 78 article.
Right. So it's like a super bummer.
The positives
It's a
were
real roller coaster on this episode, guys.
when Carr and colleagues looked at the results of studies from 92 to 98, it did appear that there were more studies looking at participants in more naturalistic settings, and the studies that were looking at participants in naturalistic settings did have a significantly higher percentage of time spent on looking at treatment outcomes and treatment acceptability. I think it was like seven times as much than studies that just looked at an analog setting. So, hey, Billy was in the FA room and that's where everything was done.
Right.
You
Which
probably
makes
see less.
sense.
Yeah.
That does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I guess that's good, right?
Yes, that's good.
That's a positive. If we're not, we shouldn't be all negative Nancys. Sorry to the Nancys out there.
But you're negative. I mean, everyone tells you. Carr and colleagues kind of put out 4 possible hypotheses as to why did this happen? Why aren't we all more jazzed about social validity measurement? And I like them because they're very practical. The idea of, well, why the heck would anyone put that in their articles to Java? Because it's not an editorial requirement of Java. Then there's kind of the similar idea, too, that possibly, well, the editorial process itself might be considered its own form of social validity. So I guess everyone just assumes that if we're accepted in Java, it must have good social validity, which I guess to some extent might be true, except for the editors really aren't the recipients of any of the treatments in place. They are the editors of these articles. So that's not true.
That's not again, the target population.
Yeah. And they sort of talk about these 2 reasons, like that maybe there's no sense that ever was the case. And also, if that were the case, it wouldn't have significantly changed from the late 70s to the mid 90s. So you would either see an increase or a decrease, or it would stay stable. And that's not the trend that they saw.
I always wonder too, if that's what gets deleted, right? Because of content validity problems, because it's a subjective measure and you have to hit a word count, right? With maybe that is the part that authors have needed to edit out. I don't think so, but that's something also that we don't know that could potentially be a problem.
We don't fully know.
We don't.
I would be surprised if it were not at least mentioned.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. You know, like social validity data were collected and available
from the
upon
first
request.
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's only, what's that, like 10 words?
Right. Yeah.
There's also the possibility that, well, maybe most of the articles being published in Java from the mid-'80s to the late 90s were related to sort of basic processes of research, which you wouldn't really need social validity. But again, they double-checked. The authors double-checked. And no, there were plenty of articles about basic research, but there were also plenty of articles about treatment. They were about 50-50. So that can't be the case. So they kind of come down to the thought of, we're not really sure why this isn't something that's being published more.
I love that. I love that, though, right? Because that's how all articles should end.
Yeah.
Shrug.
No.
We don't, but it's true.
Face.
But we never do know, right? As a science, we can't 100% ever be sure. And this is the most beautiful of philosophic doubt as I can see. Like, I don't know. Let's figure it out, everyone.
I think, and Carr does bring up the same concerns that Wolf had, is if we as a field don't look at social validity, we run the risk of being a field that, like, look at our great science that nobody cares about because it is not important as far as anyone else is concerned. And also the idea of, if we want to continue improving our measurement systems, if we don't engage with the subjective measurements that are sort of inherent in social validity measurements nowadays, we will never come up with better systems that improve our ability to collect that information in a more objective measure, as closely objective as you can get.
I agree, though, right? So if we can't be human with humans, wow. Just got really deep right there. If we can't, but really, like, if we can't take all of the collateral effects, like the feelings, the emotions, the private events, right, the collateral behaviors, and if we can't account for those, then no one is going to want us to be in their court, right? They're going to toward cognitive behavioral therapy because they try to do everything, right? And I always tell this story before. I tell the story a lot. Maybe I haven't told it here, but one time I was walking by an intro to psychology class at a other university that I do not currently work at, but I used to work at, and they were just like, well, behavior analysis is really neat, but they only deal with behavior and they can't deal with the whole person. And I was like, wow! And I like did a slow turn in. I was like, actually, if that's what other fields think of us, then what do the mainstream people think of us?
And we do run that risk of other fields sort of co-opting a lot of our science and then putting it into terminology that people like because it sounds more touchy-feely, it sounds more subjective, and then
accessible.
And it's more accessible, but it also then loses a lot of what makes behavior analysis work, and then results in, well, we took the topography of all of your treatments, but we don't understand why they work. Therefore, when things go wrong, we can't fix it, and
Bag of tricks.
It's our bag of tricks. See, exactly, Dan, our bag of tricks. But Carr does mention, hey, there was this cool study that we read recently by Hanley and colleagues back in 97 about this concurrent chains procedure. That might be interesting to look at for social validity. And then we kind of get to what I would consider phase 3 of social validity and behavior analysis. Sure. I don't know if anyone's ever discussed social validity phases. So let's say we're the first. And that was phase 2, was the 80s and the go-go 90s. And now we're going to get into phase 3.
I like the phase 3. And one thing I love about the concurrent chains is that's derived from basic research. It is a procedure that's commonly used with non-humans to figure out, what schedule is more preferred. Mm-hmm. So it's been commonly used in rats and pigeons in the 40s and 50s and Skinner's earlier work. One reason why I love it is because it's not just some random bag of tricks that someone's like, oh, let's try this, right? They were like, ooh, thinking about how can we use what someone's already been done and shown to be effective to help advance our field, which is what we should be doing, right? Looking to the literature, even if it's not applied literature, to figure out how we can modify what's already been done to make our research better.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so neat.
So in looking at social validity, here we have this the article by Hanley and colleagues in which the issue of social validity, or at least one portion of social validity, was responded to with, like you were saying, Jackie, that reviewed the basic literature to create a procedure that we might be able to use as a direct, objective measurement of a form of social validity in terms of client preference for treatments. So let's talk about that article. The beginning of phase 3 of social validity. Please, everyone use that. We want to be known for making something
patent pending.
Yeah.
I don't know, Rob. You got a pretty good handle on this topic, maybe.
I read this article,
I smell a thought paper coming on.
Oh, yeah.
This article is not the 97 article.
Replication. Yeah.
Yeah. So Hanley Hanley and his whole group have a series of these articles that use the concurrent chains arrangement to test preference for treatment. Mm-hmm. And the first one was in 97, but there are 3 or 4 of them. And then there's also a summative paper in which he doesn't cite particular study, but he gives everyone an overview of how one might conduct this type of research. And there's a really great little graphic that's in there too that shows how the concurrent chains arrangement would operate with respect to varying schedules of reinforcement, which is really handy. So if anyone's interested in knowing more, it's 2010. It's Hanley and BAP toward effective and preferred programming, a case for the objective measurement of social validity with recipients of behavior change programs.
Okay.
All right. So I recommend checking that one out if you want to know more.
That sounds like the culmination of phase 3 right there.
Soon we'll be on to phase 4.
So this is a really cool article. So we're back to the 2005 Hanley, Piazza, Fisher, and Maggiolari article in JABA. And in this article, they were looking at the effectiveness of varying types of treatments on self-injury for 2 participants, Jay and Betty. Mm-hmm. And they evaluated treatment with a punishment component and a treatment with an extinction component.
An FCT. Yep, they had an FCT with extinction, an FCT with punishment, and then an NCR for J only.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that they did conduct a functional analysis prior to the treatments, and the behavior was maintained via social positive reinforcement.
So what was interesting about this study is it was really in 2 parts. The first part was they made a comparison between these procedures to determine what was going to be an effective treatment for Jay and Betty. For Jay, they initially did a baseline, then they did an alternating treatments design comparing an FCT condition to request for attention and an NCR condition in which attention was freely available. Both of those were effective at reducing levels of problem behavior. They did a return to baseline in which problem behavior increased again. They did a comparison again. It was brought back down. They did an FCT only condition, which responding did not maintain at low levels. So then they moved on to add in a punishment component to the FCT condition, which was a hands-down procedure, a brief hands-down procedure. They then
hands down, that is the best procedure I have ever remembered. Always remember.
Dad joke.
That was a dad joke. They then went back to the FCT only to see if that would be effective without the punishment procedure. Unfortunately, it was not. They saw levels increase well above the initial baseline levels.
I think that's a 99 song, too.
I
Sorry.
don't think it was that old.
It's not that old song.
I don't know. You can look it up if you want.
You know what? I will. Keep talking, though.
And then they ended with the FCT plus punishment condition for him, which was highly effective.
Right.
For Betty, things were a little bit simpler. She had high rates of aggression in baseline. FCT brought those levels down to moderate levels, but still above clinical acceptability. They added in a punishment component for her as well. That brought levels of aggression down to near zero rates. They did return to FCT only. Unfortunately, that did not keep rates down. It went back up to prior levels, and then they re-implemented the FCT plus punishment condition, and that was effective for Betty.
Yeah. One thing they did note for Jay, too, was that NCR was effective at reducing problem behavior. However, it didn't strengthen any alternative behavior, so that's why they chose that FCT plus punishment to move to the next round, let's say, because it also was teaching an alternative skill.
Right. And if ever you're using punishment, then that is a
good thing to do.
Component that should most definitely be included is increasing an appropriate alternative behavior.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an interesting component of the study, right? But we had seen likely research like that done before. We know that those are effective procedures at decreasing problem behavior. What they really wanted to know in this study was, how did Jay and Betty feel about the different treatments that they were being exposed to?
And they gave them a Likert scale, and
Yeah, right.
They sat him down in a big armchair and said, "Now, Jay."
They didn't. You know, that may or may not be reliable for anyone, first of all. And if you have an individual who has limited vocal verbal repertoire, then likely a measurement system like that isn't going to give you an effective response. So what they did instead was they implemented a concurrent chains arrangement, which, like Jackie said, was brought over from the experimental literature. In order to do this, they needed to have the conditions that were the varying treatment conditions associated with a certain color. And they did that by exposing the participants to those conditions with
the construction
poster
paper.
board?
Yep, it was construction paper, and then the buttons that they had to click or press were also those similar colors. So the colors were red, blue, and white. Very American.
Was very American.
Yep. And there's 3 because there's a control condition initially, but then that was linked with punishment later.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like punishment alone was 1.
So they did that in order for the varying treatment conditions to be associated with a particular color. And then when they moved that over to the concurrent chains arrangement, those were presented side by side. And initially they were prompted.
Concurrently, would you say?
Well, I didn't want to be confusing. So in the concurrent chains arrangement, they had the 3 switches, the blue, the white, the red, out simultaneously. And initially they prompted them to press each switch so they could access the treatment condition that was associated with it. And following that initial exposure period, they then allowed the participant to select one of those 3 switches on their own. So there's part of the arrangement in which the switches are present is the initial link. And upon pressing one of the switches, they then move into what's called the terminal link, which is actually experiencing the treatment condition associated with it. So one color had the FCT associated with it, one had the punishment only associated with it, and one had the FCT plus punishment associated with it.
Right. And to further facilitate discrimination, for Betty, they actually told her these rules because she could understand these types of rules. And for Jay, they conducted exposure conditions until he touched a button 5 times independently. So I think that's not something he was doing previously. So when he started doing that, then they started the arrangement.
Yeah. In a concurrent chains arrangement, you're not actually measuring the problem behavior anymore, right? So like what happens once you enter into the terminal link is less important for this part of the study. The real DV here is how many times the particular switch was activated in the initial link component. So that's the DV that they were looking at here. And very often, these data are presented in a cumulative record. Woo-hoo.
Oh.
Right? You don't get to see those very often, but they're not always presented that way. But it's kind of one of the only times you sometimes see that. So what they were looking at then is how many times per session was each initial link selected. And ultimately, that's what's going to determine the preference for that treatment that then follows the initial link selection.
Right. In this study, they did not use cumulative records.
No, but I just wanted to mention it because I love them so much.
I do too.
The next one will.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Phew.
Thank goodness.
Right. So here they're just a line graph, and they just tallied up the number of switch presses on each condition per session. And it was surprising, I think.
Yeah, so the results really were surprising. I wonder if they were surprised by the results. I think they might have been.
Yeah, who knows?
Right. I'm always surprised when I read them. So for both Jay and Betty, they selected the punishment-only condition, rarely to never.
So not surprising.
That's not surprising. However, what is surprising is that both Jay and Betty selected the FCT plus punishment condition most often.
Betty almost exclusively.
Almost exclusively.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, after session 2, she was like, I don't know what you guys are thinking, but obviously I like this one better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Jay's results, he selected FCT plus punishment more, but he also sometimes selected FCT as well, but not the punishment only. I think if you weren't sure what would happen here, your guess would probably be FCT, right? And not the punishment component. But that's not what they found, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
One of the main reasons that they talk about, the likely reason why they got these results, is the FCT plus punishment condition allowed almost all responding that occurred within that condition to be met with reinforcement, right? So punishment essentially decreased the challenging behavior to 0, right? So the only behavior that was occurring within that condition was the appropriate alternative response that had been taught, which was then being met with reinforcement. So basically almost all responding that occurred, there was like 100% FR1 reinforcement schedule going on.
Do you know what would be fascinating is if somehow someone could give me all of this raw footage of all of these sessions and you could go back and measure reinforcer rate and see if the like you're saying, like they're 100%. I wonder if the reinforcer rate is higher, right? We don't necessarily know, but could be that there's just so much more reinforcer available and present in the FCT plus punishment, which is counterintuitive, right? Because it's like, plus punishment! Like, that's what I think.
We get to a similar point, I think, in the Gabor study.
Right.
But before we go on to that Gabor study, Diana, did you any final thoughts on the Hanley et al. Study?
No, I think that's good. I think that this whole line of research, like I said, there's several of these Hanley studies, and they each pick up a different aspect of the question to ask, are really great. And some of the only examples we have of recent work done in social validity using the concurrent chains arrangement, in which we're asking the client, which one of these do you prefer, right? And it's such an important question to be asking. And I think the way that they came up with asking it is just ingenious.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see it being done more. I know that it can be time consuming, right? You have to like initially establish the initial link and the value of that for each condition, and then go through the process of the concurrent chains arrangement. But it's so worthwhile to be able to say, I have these 2 treatments, both of them seem effective, which one does my client like more? Let's use that. Like, that's just so valuable to me and such at the heart of what it is that we should be doing as behavior analysts that I just love it.
Yeah. All right. The concurrent chains procedure, I think, is a fabulous way to look at that social appropriateness of the procedures. So kind of that second social validity component that Wolf talked about. And then the Gabor et al. Study, which we'll talk about now, kind of gets at that same piece of social validity, looking at it from the perspective not of the consumer, but of the caregiver who may be implementing whichever treatment is eventually determined to be the most effective for the students. And Jackie, did you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, why don't we tag team this one, Rob? I'll talk about the methods and procedures, and you can talk about the results.
I'll just do color commentary.
Nice. All right.
Sweet sassy mo lassie.
So this article really focuses on caregiver preference. So we're looking here at the preferences of 5 caregivers, and they were looking at the preferences across 3 different treatments that may help with behavior that's maintained by social positive reinforcement of their kids.
Jackie, we've been talking a lot about acceptability of treatments. Acceptability and treatments are exactly the same thing, right?
Well, what do you mean, Rob?
They mean 2 different things.
Well, tell me about it.
Oh, okay. Well, why don't I? So, at least in this article, when we're talking about defining acceptability versus preference, acceptability really refers to the idea that there's kind of an extent that an individual will find the components. I'll just read the quote.
Sure.
Extent to which individual finds the components of or the outcome of an intervention to be justifiable. So really that idea of, I think this would be something that could be used. It would be okay to use this treatment to solve this problem.
Right.
Whereas preference, again, according to the authors, but I would agree with these definitions, is, quote, extent to which one intervention is chosen over other concurrently available interventions. So
Which makes sense.
Yeah, if you're talking about the acceptability of a treatment, it's the idea of, hey, would you use this treatment? Sure, that sounds like it would be something that would be okay to use. Whereas preference would be, hey, here's 2 treatments, pick one.
And I think that's important. I think that goes along with what we always talk about with buy-in, right?
Mhm.
So people can think, oh, yeah, that's really awesome, but are they necessarily going to do that? Maybe not, right?
Mhm.
They may not prefer that treatment over another. So I know many of us have sat down with, our constituents, if that's a word that you should use. And you're like, I have this amazing behavior plan. And they're like, yeah, that'll totally work. But then they don't do it, right? Because they don't prefer it, right? For various reasons. So they suggested that caregivers really like, in one of the articles that we read, caregivers like things that are easy to do, that don't have a lot of components and are effective, right? So if I give a very complex behavior plan, they're probably not going to prefer that, right? Because it's going to take a lot of time and effort. I agree my whole life, right? I want things to be easy to understand and work.
Yeah, or when you think about, say, like a punishment procedure, I would think a lot of people would probably refer to punishment procedures as being something that they don't find acceptable.
Right.
However, given the choice, most people prefer to use punishment because it's really easy and fast and can be, quote unquote, effective in the short term.
Right. Yeah, and so with this study...
Not us, of course, but, other people.
Of course not. And one thing
people don't always realize what actually is punishment.
No, the average person does not know that they're engaged in a punishment procedure.
And so
it's a topic for another day.
Sure is. We'll have to just do a whole punishment.
Maybe we should do 2 episodes all about punishment and coercion.
You think so? I don't know.
Spoiler. Stay tuned. So really what they were doing is extending the literature on treatment or on social validity, because previous studies had looked at case studies, measured accessibility using the treatment evaluation inventory, used the TARF revised.
What is the TARF?
It's like
Alf's brother.
The treatment acceptability rating form.
Revised.
I didn't know there were so many acronyms.
Like a Star Wars character.
So what they did in these is they used case studies. So they actually didn't implement the procedures, but they read about the procedures and then rated them on their acceptability. So that is okay.
You can do this work from home.
Right? That's okay. Sure, we all want to rate acceptability of case studies, but it doesn't tell us what we would actually like if we actually had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that's where this research really extends the literature by teaching parents 3 different ways that they can help decrease their child's problem behavior, which is obviously a problem, teaching them how to do it, and then asking them, which one do you prefer doing? Mm-hmm. They're all effective. Mm-hmm. Yay. Mm-hmm. Now you have the choice. Out of all 3, what one would you prefer to do? And then actually do it.
Well, the other piece, too, being that there have been, when there had been previous research looking at preference, a lot of times it was based on, I'm going to show you a video of the therapist or the behavior technician or the researcher engaging in this treatment. And what do you think? Would you use this? And then after they chose which treatment they'd prefer, then they would be trained in just that treatment.
Right.
So would there be a difference in parents liking one treatment or another, caregivers, liking one treatment or over another if they had to actually engage in all of the treatments and then use that experience to determine,
I like that.
I like this one the best. And
I like that too.
That was one of the big differences here, is that having that experience piece being a component of the preference.
So they use behavioral skills training in not so many words.
I know. I wrote that on the side.
Me too.
It's BSD.
Yeah, they never referred to it as such, though.
To train NCR, DRO, and DRA. And they specifically looked at components such as extinction, reinforcement delivery, and prompts delivered. And they took data on whether the caregivers were correct or incorrect on those responses. And they had pretty high agreement. When I looked at you look at the treatment integrity data, I think the lowest was 68% at one point, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
They were pretty happy, although they did refer to it only took a few or a couple of, I think they said a few trials, and then one of the participants took 9 sessions, which a few is not enough.
No.
Right. Let me just note, too, they do, in the keywords for the article, list behavior skills training.
Good.
Oh, okay. Just
So
not in the article
if you search
itself.
for behavioral skills training,
This
this
would
will
come
pop up.
That's nice.
They just didn't call it that in the methods.
Good. So yeah, so they did all of that. An FA was run and demonstrated that the problem behaviors were in fact maintained by social positive reinforcement, which is always good.
Mhm.
And then they provided that caregiver training, and then following 100% accuracy of one session, the caregivers completed the intervention rating profile, which assessed how they felt on each of the
So that was
treatments.
a rating of acceptability of
Right.
treatments.
Yeah. And then the parents or caregivers experienced the experience trials. I
The
love
worst
that.
ride at Disneyland, the treatment experience.
Where they practice each of the treatments with their child. And if in any of the sessions they received below 90% accuracy on the treatment integrity, they had additional training,
Mhm.
which included behavioral skills training.
It did not always include feedback, though,
Not
unless the caregiver asked for feedback. And I did
Mhm.
like this because the goal here was not to assess which treatment was the best. The goal here was also not to inadvertently skew the parents' preferences
Right.
by being like, hey, when you ran FCR, here's all the ways you screwed it up. And the parent, like, well, I didn't choose FCR because
Right.
it was very punishing how
Aversive.
mean you were.
Right, yeah.
So they really
smart.
did.
Which is smart.
Which I never would have thought of that. I would have, done the feedback and just, oh, well, they needed more feedback because they didn't understand how to do the treatment. But they really did back off on that treatment unless it was asked for
Right.
to avoid that confound.
Yeah.
Right. And then,
Although, like you were saying, if a treatment's more complex, then it's going to be harder to learn.
right.
Mhm.
And it's going to be
Right?
harder to follow and then implement.
Yeah. So it would be harder. You would get more feedback.
Yeah. And it might be more aversive. Maybe. Right.
But that was in the treatment setting, though. So not necessarily when they were engaged with their child or with the participant they were
Right,
working
because
with.
there's a teacher involved.
Yep.
I love that her name is Miss. They're like Sandy, Barbara, and Miss Sandman. That's not her name, but it's just like this was the teacher. And then once the experience trials were completed, they did the choice trials, and they were very similar to Hanley and colleagues, where they had a concurrent change procedure to assess caregiver preference, and they ended the whole procedure when they had 4 consecutive trials for preference for one of the different.
They did not get a microswitch, though. They just got a bunch
No.
of cards with a description of each treatment, and they
But
just
that's fair
picked the
because you can
card.
actually take those cards home.
Yep.
Right? So that's the nice thing is that's
It's a parting gift.
it's a
And-
parting gift. Like if you're going to use this, here you go. Take it home. It's your written instructions.
I don't think we talked about they had a fourth. They had a none card that they
Yeah.
could choose. Like, these treatments are stupid. I'll do whatever I want to was pretty much what was on the card.
Yep, that's true. So what happened, Rob?
We've got a couple things we're looking at. First, we're looking at the
Ooh.
acceptability of the treatments, both pre and post experience and choice trials. And then we also have the results of the concurrent chains procedure.
In a cumulative record.
Here's our cumulative
Here it
record.
is.
The time it was so sad we didn't have. So again, the results of the FA you already mentioned. All the the challenging behavior that was assessed here was maintained by some sort of a positive social reinforcement. So their attention, delivery of items. All the caregivers were able to learn the treatment sessions in only a couple sessions, 3 to 5. They were able to learn the different interventions. Most of them reached that kind of 100% criteria within 3 to 9 sessions. If we want to look at the preference results, when the choice trials were conducted, 2 of the caregivers preferred DRA, 2 preferred either DRA or DRO to the NCR procedure, because not all of them actually came up with a very clear preference. Many of them just sort of had a general preference, like overall, they chose DRA or DRO more than NCR. One of them really didn't have any intervention preference, however, did prefer all of them to the control, so the none. So there was definitely some sort of a preference. It did seem to lean a little bit more towards the differential reinforcement procedures. And then we've also got to look at the acceptability ratings. So the acceptability ratings were a bit different in that prior to doing any of the experience trials, 2 of the caregivers said, all of these seem equally acceptable to me. 3 felt that DRA was the most acceptable. And so that's our five participants here.
5.
Then after, when they did the acceptability questionnaire again, after the experience and after the choice trials, there was a shift. There were still 3 that rated DRA as most acceptable. 2 found DRO to be most acceptable. And then 2 said NCR is unacceptable. They did not seem to like NCR very much.
Well, that makes sense, right? Because if you know how to do everything else, you'd rather teach an alternative behavior than nothing.
Well, that's what
Sure.
we think.
right? That's
Well,
what we'd
and-
hope.
And that's what some research has pointed to. People
Right.
like contingencies rather than lack of
Right.
contingencies.
So we have a
for
whole episode
reinforcement.
on that. Episode 57. Do humans prefer contingencies?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then also you might be asking, well, what about the children? Did these treatments result in a decrease in challenging behavior and an increase in appropriate behavior? And I guess kind of. They didn't really get too much into it. None of them really ran the treatments out to be, get down to zero rates of behavior. But again, that wasn't the purpose of the study. It was there any improvement in children's behavior? Was there any increase in appropriate behavior? And for the most part, they all made some improvements with the different treatments. But that, again, wasn't the focus, was to get the children's problem behavior down to near zero rates.
What I thought was interesting is that for at least one of the adults in the study who did not have a real clear differentiation between their preference for the treatments, the participant that they were working with also did not show a clear differentiation in their responding between the treatments either. So you could think that there overall did not appear to be a lot of difference as far as how their behavior was being met with reinforcement, as far as reduction in the children's response. So it would make sense, therefore.
Yeah. And it does get to kind of the big points of the study, being that if you have to pick a study out of nowhere and you just don't have time to do any sort of a concurrent links procedure, no preference, I guess choose DRA if you can. I mean, I think the average behavior analyst probably say, if I could pick any treatment to just throw on a kid, I'd throw on a DRA procedure. We all love DRA. You're teaching something new. It's increasing sort of an appropriate behavior while still decreasing problem behaviors.
Yeah, it's solid.
Also, this article kind of goes in the face of the kind of the common sense of everyone will love NCR because it's so damn easy. Actually, no, none of these parents really loved NCR when all was said and done, especially after they implemented all of the treatments, which again seems weird because of all the treatments, you don't have to do anything. You kind of just hang out, and at some point, reinforcement.
I think that's harder sometimes too, when there's nothing to do, to remember to do something.
Yeah.
I mean, based on that other research, everyone
prefers doing something.
Response tends to allocate towards reinforcement.
Yep.
Right? And in that case, you're not necessarily providing reinforcement, and therefore your behavior may not be met with reinforcement either.
Yeah. The other thing that was kind of important to note was when looking at why some of these preferences might have occurred, in addition to the idea that most humans do prefer some sort of a contingency in their procedures, there's possibly the preferences related to the alternative behaviors, the rates of alternative behavior. Because what was noted is that for two of the caregivers who preferred DRA, the children that they were caregiving actually engaged in a much higher rate of the appropriate behavior.
Right,
Whereas the ones that had less of a preference or no specific preference, you really didn't see that pattern of a significant improvement in the rate of appropriate behavior. So it may be a matter of it was more salient for them that they saw that improvement in appropriate behavior. So of course now they love DRA. That could be the reason you see that preference. So again, if they'd worked on the treatments more, if they'd been able to show a higher rate of appropriate behavior, whichever treatment led to that, you might have seen more solid preferences. Who knows? Idea for the future. And this also points to the idea that just getting a sense of acceptability might not have any relation to what the final preference of the caregivers will be in terms of treatment planning. So just because you have a bunch of treatments and a parent says, those all sound great to me, really isn't going to, and even if they have one, they say, I like that one the best, doesn't necessarily mean that is going to turn out to be the most preferred treatment.
Right.
And particularly if you're asking them to implement it themselves.
Yep.
Right.
Let's move into dissemination station, because we've gone over a lot of articles. We've covered a lot of time, many phases.
Phase 4. Future research.
The future. So
the distant future.
We mostly talked about that that component of treatment acceptability in terms of rating social validity. I think to some extent it goes without saying that for most of these participants, that first piece of social validity of, is this something that anyone cares about? We're talking about participants who are in some sort of a hospital or research setting for problem behavior. So there hopefully was some sort of a talk about, hey, it seems like this is important to you that your child not engage in these tantrum behaviors or this aggression or property destruction. But we didn't explicitly go into that. We mostly focused on that second piece. And we didn't really talk too much about outcomes as well. So what's the future hold for social validity?
I think people really should look into the research looking at for that participatory action research. I think it has a lot of validity. And I think it brings us down to the level of helper rather of leader, right? So if we're looking to change socially significant problems, we should know which problems are socially significant.
Yeah.
Although the participatory action research does have its limitations, right? Because the community as a whole also has a say in the procedures, may limit the scientific rigor that you might have, right? But if your desire is to change behavior that's going to be appropriate, maybe you lose some of that in order to gain, more value and more buy-in from the participants. So I think it's a fine line, but I really would suggest people look into that literature. So I'm going to just say it again: White 2002 and Fawcett 1991. I'm sure there's more, but those are the ones that I've read the most about, and I think that would be an interesting way for us to move forward as a science. Also, I know we've talked about this a ton, but looking at how we can change the problem of social significance around culture, right?
Yeah.
And cultural competence. So
Right.
Diana's our resident smart person in that area.
Am
So-
I?
Yeah, you are. I mean, you've done a lot of work around this.
Yeah,
and-
so what may be a valid goal for one community or culture may not be stressed in a different culture, and recognizing that the population that you may be serving may have different values in their culture is one important step when you're setting goals. And then also recognizing how you might best gather the information from your clients regarding social acceptability of the treatments you're proposing and the effects of those treatments is equally important. And that's an area in which very little research has been done.
Oh, no, when you say that, Diana, are you referring to the idea of, how much bias is going to creep into when you give people that questionnaire, in terms of how you ask the questions, and also
Yes.
the idea that most people, when they get a questionnaire, are very rarely going to use the entire Likert scale. They're going to focus more on either, really strong negative or positive ideas, or
Or
else
people like me that only do the middle.
yeah, I don't want to hurt anyone's
I don't wanna
feelings.
offend.
Yeah. Even though this treatment was the worst thing that ever happened to me, I feel bad. I should probably say 3, no preference, or something. Yeah.
Yeah, recognizing the difficulties in translation of something of that nature, right? As well as varying power dynamics between practitioner and client. Clients who want to please the practitioner and say that this was great, I'm totally going to implement it at home, when in fact it's something that's beyond feasible for the family or against their cultural values. And if you as a practitioner haven't come in and assessed that properly with the type of care that's needed, then you're not going to get the answers from the family that's ultimately going to benefit them.
Has there been anything looking at, say, if you did, because again, thinking about your third branch of social validity, the idea of, hey, I was such a good researcher. I did my questionnaire after they left the clinic about what did you think about this treatment? Looking at results of those questionnaires versus if, say, like 2 weeks later, there was someone who just came and they were Confederate or something, and they just came and said, hi, I'm from the clinic and I need to know just factually about this treatment, whether there's a differentiation in terms of results. That might be one way to look at it. Who should be giving? Talking about power dynamic. If you had someone who said, my job is just I don't know anything about this treatment. I'm some sort of, I'm blind to the research. I'm just here from the clinic to get this information from you. Do you see differentiated results? Because there's not that.
I don't even know if that work's being done at all.
Right.
For one thing.
That seems like super easy, right? Doesn't
Do it.
Well, it seems important work, and I think that there are a lot of variables there that are going to impact the types of results that you get back, and how close those are to what's actually going on in the home is probably quite varied, right? But I don't know. I mean, I don't actually know if that work has been done, but I think it is important.
It sounds like something they talk about on like Freakonomics, like, oh, they did a funny study where they looked at this and then they compared it with these people asking the questions and then these people asking the questions. It seems like a psychology type question. Not to be I don't mean that pejoratively to psychology, but it does seem like the sort of thing that some lab must be looking at in terms of interpersonal relations. I
know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the buzzwords to look that up or might not be in our repertoire.
Yeah. But I'd be curious. But that might take care of some of the power differential in terms of that last branch of, did you find the treatment outcomes to be effective? Because I think we have some technology that you could use to find out if the preference is there, which is objective. It does exactly what I think Wolf was looking for, is can we turn this subjective measure into something objective that we can all be happy with?
A virtual high five in the sky. Wolf's hand comes down and Hanley's hand comes up and they're like, boom.
One can only hope.
Yeah, I hope. Cool.
So I guess the other question, too, for the average practitioner, should they be looking at using the concurrent chains procedure for their treatments? Is that something that we should be using all the time? Some of the time, there's not enough time.
I think it's going to depend, unfortunately, right? It's going to depend on what sort of environment you work in and what sort of time constraints you have, right? So if it's going to be taking away time from treatment in a sense that treatment may have been stalled, right, because you're waiting for preference, then maybe not. But maybe if you do have that sort of time, then yeah.
Mhm.
Or if you're seeing that a student is maybe displaying some aversive side effects when you're engaging in one treatment over the other, maybe you do a quick assessment then, right? So maybe there's some emotional responding, right? If you're using NCR, there's a lack of responding, right? Which could be a side effect of NCR. So that might be a time when you might want to do it, maybe.
I also would be curious too, what if you had a client or a consumer who had a very strong preference for a certain treatment, and then when you were looking at the effectiveness of the treatment, you found that the preferred treatment actually had no effectiveness.
That's a hard one,
You
right?
know, what do you do then? Say, well, I know you like this, but I don't care. It's not working. You do have to take into account you probably have other consumers. You know, the parent of the child would also say, I don't really care their preference. I need them to stop punching and throwing things. But then you are acting against, preference. And as an adult, that sort of becomes something that we do a lot. Would be interesting to see. Does that ever happen too? Do humans tend to prefer the treatments that result in more positive reinforcement? In some of the studies, it seems like that was the trend, but we're only talking about a couple participants. So I'd be curious if that holds out.
Right. I mean, overall,
over time.
this research suggests as a whole body that humans prefer contingencies and for their behavior to be meaningfully directed towards accessing reinforcement. So I think that that's sort of like an overall takeaway here.
Right.
And I do think it's a little bit of a luxury as far as time goes to be able to do these types of treatment assessments, and it doesn't devalue them. I think they're really valuable. But if you were in that situation, Rob, perhaps you could look at the components that are preferred in the treatment and see if there would be a way to incorporate those into that individual's day in other ways.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we've talked a lot about social validity. What a fun ride it has been. But there's still one more thing I want to do before we go. And that's make sure that everyone hears our second secret code word. And it is curious. CURIOUS.
Wow, that was amazing.
I'm going to say it one more time. CURIOUS.
Like the monkey.
George?
Yeah, him.
Curious George.
Yeah.
Yep. He's pretty
Or
curious.
like Alice.
Yep. Curious. Just like we all should be curious. Curious behavior analysts. Curious. Well, that brings us to the end of another awesome episode. Well, we had fun, I guess.
We don't really know.
We don't know if it was awesome or not.
Again, it's for the audience to decide.
Right, but it was fun.
Which episode do you prefer? Pick one. Not this one? Oh, hopefully this one. We had a good time. And that's what really matters. Our own social validity. We appreciate everyone out there listening. If you liked this show, why not subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you download podcasts. You can also find these episodes posted on our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find the links to the research articles as well as to get CEUs if you are so inclined. And you can find these posted on YouTube with the YouTube subtitle feature. If you're interested in following us anywhere else, well, we're all over social media as ABA Inside Track. And of course, we really, really love getting emails from you at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Diana, for being
Rob.
here. Thanks to Kyle Sturry for our fabulous interstitial music. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye!